Percussion is the backbone of any track. It serves as a way to keep the rhythm, and overall is a foundation that grounds your song. And for this reason, it's important that you take some time to learn how to create the highest quality drums as possible when producing music. It's the difference between creating something that sounds like this, and something that sounds like this. My inspirations. My name is Inspirasper, and today I'm going to share with you a few tips and tricks I've picked up over the years on how you can improve your drums. Here's what we go through in this video. This is more or less the process I take when making my percussion, starting from scratch and then going all the way through until I have a complete set of percussion, like we heard earlier in the beginning of this video. So let's start off with trick number one that I've learned. This one is a bit self-explanatory and will honestly put you a good bit of the way to having good sounding drums. But what I would highly recommend doing is get a hold of some high quality samples. Samples are just audio files, so a .mp3 or a .wav, and in this case, just drum samples. One thing I'd recommend you do is just look up free kick samples or maybe hi-hat loops. Best drum sample packs. You can find tons of high quality samples this way, be it either free or, mind you, some of them can be paid. Keep in mind, you do get what you pay for, right? If you chip in, say, I don't know, $5 to a sample pack or something like that, if it's by a reputable source, odds are those will be really high quality samples. Having these samples serves as a foundation for your drums. Well, in this case, I'm using Ableton. Ableton comes with some samples, say this kick sample right here. These are fine and they'll do the job, but for me personally, I think there are some better options out there. And you really do want to start with the best quality sample as possible. It's hard to start with something bad and then try and polish it to make it sound good. You want to start with something high quality that you can work off of. And you should consider doing this for all of the percussion you use, including, but not limited to, your kicks, snares, hi-hats, rides, cymbals, toms, shakers, general loops, and maybe even some foley. Once you've acquired all your samples, we can move ahead to step number 2, and that is to just lay out a rough structure of your drum loop. This is the equivalent of writing a rough draft or sketching before your beautiful painting. All I'm looking to do when I get to this point is just create a rough rhythm. Does it have the general beat that I'm looking for? Does it have the flow that I'm kind of thinking of? Usually I'll just start off with a kick and a snare. Lay those out in whatever fashion that I want. If you haven't already, make sure that you are in the proper BPM that you are looking for and in the right time signature. Obviously this will vary for whatever it is you're trying to create. That's not something I can tell you, but you want to set that first before you start creating your drum loop, and then afterwards you can tweak it, I guess, but it's always nice to get in the rough ballpark, you know? So I have my kick sample that I really like, and I'm just gonna draw these in on my kicks layer in a rough fashion. And then I'll just do the same with my snares. And for a rough layout, that's not too bad. You get a general feel for what the percussion may sound like coming up in the future. My next suggestion is to start stacking layers on top of each other. While one sample can do the job, I generally find it's best to stack a few samples on top of each other to kind of get a hybrid sound. It's not just one sample you found off the internet, you kind of combine a few of them to make your own unique sound, sort of, kind of. Essentially what I'm getting at here is you can mix and match these samples to create something along the lines of what you would like. If you're happy with a sample and you want to keep it, that's perfectly fine. This is just a suggestion. One fun trick I've learned is adding a transient to your drums. If I had a MIDI track and I assigned it a drum rack and then put in that kick sample that I liked before, I can go ahead and find another kick sample and also put it into this drum rack, then play it at the same time. Say for example, I really liked this kick. I can also add this in. So now instead of just having my one kick sample, I can have a second. Now, one thing to note and to be careful of is with drums, especially kicks, stacking multiple samples on top of each other can get pretty muddy pretty quickly. So you want to keep an eye on how you mix these together so they don't get too compressed. So something you can do is have one sample trigger just a little bit before the other one. Now, you don't want these to be too far apart, otherwise you just get a weird offbeat sound, but a little bit goes a long way. Or alternatively, another thing you can do, in Ableton at least, is have them play at the same time and just have one sample fade in a little bit after it's been triggered. Let's say this one sample right here, I could give it a little bit of a fade in, let's say 14 milliseconds, that's just a little bit of time. Essentially all that does is allow the other sample to breathe for an extra 15 milliseconds before it may get overtaken by your other sample. And then of course you can always lower the volume of your different sample. You can add in a third sample on top of it, mix and match these samples together. You can do the same with your snares. For example, with my snares, I did something similar where instead of just having this one sample play, I actually added 3 layers of snares. And so all I did here was add 2 different samples on top of my original snare, and then just tweaked their volumes to my liking. So now at this point in the process, after laying out a rough sketch and stacking a few layers of samples on top of each other, this is what my percussion sounds like. And now I'd like to move on to my next tip, where I'll suggest that you add in some subtle details. Fill in your percussion with miscellaneous samples. Some notable sounds to add here are a cymbal, some hi-hats, and maybe some general fills, some drum loops, for the sake of variety, for adding in some, again, subtle background sounds. One layer I added in here are some cymbals, some hi-hats, in the same exact pattern, but then I went back through and added in some more detail. So for example, I added in another hi-hat right here at this point. Some hi-hats right here. And then my last layer of hi-hats right here. Now it really feels like it's coming to life. It actually has some color to it. And it really is just these subtle details that make all the difference. But why stop now? Let's keep adding in some more. I found this shaker sound effect that I liked, so I incorporated it into my percussion like this. And now all of a sudden, that's an element that feels really natural, and I'm almost wondering, why wasn't it there before? It's one of those things that you really don't know what you're missing until you try it out. So I guess what I'm saying is feel free to experiment and try adding in things you wouldn't expect to work, and they just might feel really natural and normal. And lastly, I found some drum loops that I liked, some fills. I just looked up fill samples or something of the sort, and I added them at the end of every other bar. Altogether right now, my percussion sounds like this. Now, the next step in my process is to go through and add in some audio effects. Yeah, no, none of this was using any audio effects. So now our job is to go through and essentially mix all of these together so they play along real nicely. This includes adding in some EQing to isolate certain frequencies, some compressors to emphasize certain sounds, and maybe things such as reverb or delays to accentuate certain samples. For my kicks, I added in an EQ and a glue compressor. I use this EQ to boost some of the low ends, but also to cut off the really, really low ends. You don't want these low frequencies down here. However, somewhere around 50 hertz-ish, I boosted it so it really gives that kick a powerful punch. You'll see here around 200 hertz, I've actually ducked a little bit of this gain, and then the high ends over here are actually raised to give the kick a little bit of life. This is actually just a default preset under Ableton. You go to Audio Effects, EQ8, Drums. Ableton has some built-in drum EQs that honestly do a really good job. This glue compressor is to make the kick a little bit less harsh so that when it actually triggers, it's more soothing to your ears rather than just being super punchy. My snares, I added in a snare EQ, so in this case it cuts off some low frequencies, boosts a little bit around 200, so where that kick was lacking, and then also the high ends. I added some compressors. These are to fill out the sound a little bit more and just overall make it sound louder and brighter. My cymbals have a similar setup, a glue compressor for the same reasons as before, and a cymbal EQ to really emphasize these high ends. I mean, anything above 10,000 hertz or so really needs to be boosted. Anything else isn't as important. And then a tiny reverb to make it feel a little bit wet. Hi-hats are in a similar boat to the rides, except this time I really only need these high frequencies. I didn't need anything in the mids or lows. Shakers are the same as my rides. And that pretty much does it for my bass audio effects, with the exception of one audio effect, which I'm getting into right now. Good transition into my next tip, is to consider your stereo space. One thing that really makes your percussion come to life is to emphasize stereo. Not every layer needs to be right down the middle. Some layers tend to do better sitting on the edges on either the left or right side of your ear. Here is a rough diagram, for example, of something I'm talking about. Not everything needs to be rough mono straight down the middle, although some percussion layers tend to do better, such as your kicks. However, certain things can be emphasized in stereo just a little bit, not extreme, such as your hi-hats and your rides. So in this case, on those particular layers, I added in a really cool plugin from the Palmery collection that's called Stereo Finalizer. I love this plugin, it's honestly outstanding. I just add this into the end of my audio chain, and I can essentially widen my sound so I can morph it into extreme stereo. Here's the difference it makes on my rides. And I did the same thing with my hi-hats. And finally, my shakers. It really just makes everything come to life. It's honestly so good. So now altogether, here's what my percussion is starting to sound like. And honestly, we're getting there. That's sounding really good. However, obviously I'm not just gonna release a song that's only percussion. So let's focus on how to mix this in with the rest of our song. Moving on to my next tip, sidechaining. I've made this little loop of a song just to kind of play around with. And now let's just add our percussion on top of this and see what it sounds like. It's not bad, but it can be better. It all seems to be pretty flat. It just kind of gets muddled together and it's nothing too exciting. If you find this is the case, one thing you can do is add in what's called sidechaining. To put it short and sweet, sidechaining is the act of tying one layer to another, where anytime layer A makes a sound, layer B will duck in volume. In this case, what you can do is sidechain your kicks and snares, and maybe even other layers, to each other layer of your song. Say for example, I have this layer of pads. If I wanted this layer to duck in volume every time my kick played, I can add in sidechaining onto this layer. Now, every DAW can do this, but I'm going to teach you how to do this the Ableton way. So under your audio effects, you can go to compressor and drag that on to your desired layer that you want to be sidechained. You can click this arrow to expand the compressor and click sidechain. Now, this drop-down menu will allow you to select the layer that it's sidechained to. So in my case, I want my layer of kicks, right? I want my kicks to stand out, punch through these pads every time they play. Now I can look down here in this segment of 3 buttons. I can click this middle, and I can move this knee around to my desire. The farther left I move this knee, the more the sound will duck every time my kick plays. The harsher this angle is at, the more aggressively it'll duck to that volume. Sidechaining is its own little fickle beast, so I would recommend you play around with it yourself, maybe look up some other tutorials. So for now, I'm just gonna play around with it and get something that I like. Then once I get something I like, I can do the same for, say, my snares. I can copy this compressor, select a different input, this time to my snares, and then I want to tweak this to my liking as well. Once I'm happy with what I have, I can then move on to a different layer of my track. Say I have these leads, for example. and then I can sidechain these layers to my percussion as well. Do note that you'll want to tone each layer individually. Maybe the leads don't need to be sidechained as much as the pads, or maybe the bass really needs to be sidechained or something like that. You get the point. But if you go through and sidechain each layer, you will be left with essentially what we made at the beginning of this video. The final tip I'd like to throw out there, if you still feel like your drums aren't quite standing out the way you want them to, I would recommend building the rest of your song around your drums. Now you can do this whether or not you're starting your drums from scratch and then building the rest of the song off of them, if you already have an existing song and you're integrating the drums into it, or if you're doing a combination of the two and kind of building them up at the same time. Either way, try and make your song build around your drums. This gives you the sort of question and answer type of feedback between your song and your percussion. For example, one thing I'd like to point out that I did here was with my bass line. Let me just play you what I have for my bass right now. Something I did here is what I like from a lot of songs. My bass plays, and then right as the snare hits, it stops and leaves just a little bit of blank space. And if I play my bass with the snare, you can kind of hear what I'm talking about. Instead of just having one static, kind of honestly boring bass line, I switched it up by adding these cuts. So one, it adds a little bit of variety, it's not as monotonous, and two, it really does mix in with my percussion. Let's hear what it sounds like with the rest of my percussion. Whereas if I just used one static bass line, which, I don't know, I feel like it doesn't really make the percussion stand out as well as it possibly could. And you'll notice I do other things too, such as when my kicks hit in this triplet pattern right here, bom, 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 I'm also playing my bass at the same time. It's these sort of integrations that you should really consider when you want to make your percussion stand out. In this case, my percussion feels more powerful during these triplets because my bass is also playing at the same time. So now I've added in those low frequencies, it's rumbling, and those kicks really pop. Consider doing this with the rest of your layers too, obviously not just the bass, integrate it with the rest of your track. And then overall, if you follow these tips, hopefully your percussion will stand out just a little bit better. I know I had some trouble with this starting off, so hopefully that helped you out, and maybe you can pay me back by subscribing to this channel. If you liked this little song right here, maybe it'll be released someday, who knows? Subscribe, follow me, and maybe you'll see if it does. All right, thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Have a good one.